A leak no one expected. A father who never thought he would hear his son's name spoken inside a palace briefing again. And now Prince Harry is racing back to Britain after a revelation that has shaken both households to their core. The leak inside the winter briefing. It was just after 9 o'clock on a dim December morning when the first tremor passed through Buckingham Palace. The air outside carried that grey-blue heaviness particular to late winter, the kind that lingers over the gates like a warning. Inside, the palace was settling into its usual rhythm. Aides shuffling through schedules, private secretaries moving between offices, security staff exchanging quiet updates. But on the second floor, in a conference room usually reserved for routine winter reviews, something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The briefing packet sat in the center of the long mahogany table printed only minutes earlier. It was meant to summarize the week's internal matters, public engagements, foreign correspondence, and logistical updates ahead of Christmas. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Yet, as senior aides gathered around the table and began flipping through the pages, the atmosphere shifted. A silence rippled through the room, sharp enough to cut the stale morning air. It was the deputy private secretary who noticed it first. A page buried midway through the stack. Section 4, subsection B. A set of lines he did not recognize. A heading he had never seen in a winter briefing before. Archie Harrison, Mountbatten, Windsor. Educational notes. Confidential. The room froze for a full 5 seconds. No one spoke. No one breathed. No one dared turn the page. It made no sense. Archie was an American student now, living thousands of miles away. His schooling was private, independent of royal oversight. There should have been no reason, none, for his name to appear in an internal palace document. Where did that come from? Someone whispered. No one answered. A sinking dread took hold as the aides exchanged looks, each more unsettled than the last. The head of the sovereign's household office turned the page with the caution of a man expecting an explosion. What followed was worse than any of them feared. A brief notation about curriculum details, an overview of institutional transitions, and an archived reference to a file tied to the pre-2020 transition period. Information that should have been erased or formally transferred out of the royal system years ago. A breach not external, internal. The kind that destroys trust forever. A young digital archivist, pale, shaking barely in her first year, was summoned immediately. She scanned the document, her eyes widening. She explained, voice trembling, that during an internal reorganization of historic family files in late November, a mislabeled digital folder from early 2020 had been temporarily unlocked for cross-departmental indexing. It contained transitional notes drafted in the weeks when the Sussexes were negotiating their exit arrangements. Notes that should have been deleted but were instead misfiled, sealed electronically, and forgotten. Until now, the aides felt the temperature in the room drop. This was not a security breach. This was an institutional blunder of the highest order. One senior official pressed his palms against the table, leaning forward as if steadying himself against the weight of the moment. If even one line of this circulates beyond these walls, he said quietly, we will have a crisis that makes the spring of 2020 look tame. Another aide swallowed hard. Does His Majesty know? Not yet, came the answer. But he will. Outside the window, the bare branches scraped softly against the glass, a reminder of the winter the monarchy could not escape. The Queen had once said that storms come quietly before they come loudly. And this, everyone sensed, was the quiet part. Within minutes, the document was retrieved, locked, and escorted under protocol usually reserved for matters of state. Phones were placed face down on the table. Doors were closed. A decision was made. The king must be informed before the morning concluded. No leaks, no whispers, no misinterpretations. The matter was too volatile, too sensitive, too personally tied to a prince who had already severed nearly every official tie with the institution, accidentally holding his son's private information. As the aides dispersed, the deputy private secretary remained in the room, staring at the table where the briefing packet had rested just moments earlier. He could still feel the chill of it, the name no one expected to see, the mistake no one could undo. In another part of the palace, King Charles was preparing for a day of routine meetings, unaware that within the hour he would be confronted with a breach capable of reopening wounds his family had never healed. Because in the winter quiet of Buckingham Palace, a single misplaced file had awakened a storm. And 3 minutes later the world would begin to feel it. How Archie's records became palace property. The panic that swept through the winter briefing room did not arise merely from the presence of Archie's name in an internal document. It came from something far more unsettling. Something that forced senior aides to confront a truth the palace had tried to forget. Archie's schooling records should never have been anywhere near Buckingham Palace. Not in 2024. Not after the Sussex departure. Not after the layers of legal separation that accompanied Harry and Meghan's decision to start a life far from Windsor's shadow. Yet here they were. To understand how this happened, the palace had to trace its steps backward into the foggy, chaotic months of early 2020 when the monarchy was being reshaped in real time. The exit negotiations, known internally as the Sandringham transition, unfolded at a pace and with a complexity unseen since the abdication crisis of 1936. Meetings overlapped with emergency briefings. Departments raced to draft new protocols overnight. Some divisions updated their systems, others froze them. And in that frenzy, certain files, specific notes, and certain transitional documents fell through the cracks. Archie's file was one of them. In the earliest days of his birth, royal protocol dictated that any child in the line of succession, however distant in practice, had a placeholder dossier within the sovereign's household office. It was a relic of older rules, the kind established in the 1980s when digitization first reshaped royal record-keeping. These dossiers were not personal files. They were structural templates designed to anticipate future educational, ceremonial, and logistical considerations should a child remain within the royal system. Most were simple notes, formalities, nothing more. But when Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020, their departure set off a chain reaction that the palace was not prepared to manage. Internal systems had to determine which records to archive, which to delete, and which to transfer under privacy protection. In theory, this should have been straightforward. In practice, it was muddled by politics, emotion, and an institution struggling to understand a kind of departure it had never faced before. As departments attempted to close out the Sussex portfolios, an administrative assistant, overwhelmed and overworked, navigating a digital archive designed decades earlier, incorrectly tagged the placeholder dossier. Instead of being marked for deletion or transfer, it was filed under a transitional queue reserved for unresolved updates. The error was small, invisible, and soon forgotten. But digital systems do not forget. They wait. And 4 years later, when the sovereign's household office initiated a routine re-indexing of archived files, a process completed every winter, the forgotten folder resurfaced. Worse, because of a misapplied filter, its metadata was merged with the current year indexing protocols. Meaning that when the winter briefing packet was generated on December 4th, the system recognized the dossier as active contextual information and inserted it into the Section 4 summary. A mistake built from a mistake built from a mistake. By the time King Charles was informed, the explanation was ready, but no one dared to soften it. The truth was too stark, too brittle. The monarchy, an institution built on precision and continuity, had tripped over its own procedural skeleton. In the king's study, the senior archivist stood with both hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though trying to keep the weight of the moment from slipping through his fingers. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the records were never meant to persist. They should have been disposed of during the Sussex transition, but the protocols at that time were unclear. Some departments acted before others. It created gaps." Charles listened in heavy silence. His face did not change, but those present could see the exhaustion tighten around his eyes. He had spent the past year navigating scandal, restructuring, and internal fractures. To be confronted now with a lapse involving his grandson, one that could be interpreted as carelessness or intrusion, was almost too much to absorb. "How sensitive is the material?" Charles asked. The archivist hesitated. "Minimal, sir. Notes only." "But the implication—" "Yes," the king interrupted, closing his eyes briefly. "The implication is catastrophic because the issue was no longer simply what the file contained, but that it existed at all." In California, Harry had spent years building a life defined by boundaries, clear, hard-earned, fiercely protected. Every interview, every legal filing, every decision he made since stepping back had been driven by a single idea: safeguarding his family from the institution that raised him. And now the palace had to reckon with a truth that would sting him deeper than any headline. The monarchy still held traces of his son, not out of malice, but out of bureaucratic neglect. And in a family where wounds were already deep, neglect could cut just as sharply as intention. By noon, the palace had drafted its internal response. But no message, no apology, no procedural explanation could undo the fact that a document containing Archie's name had circulated to 10 people inside the Crown's administrative corps. 10 people. Too many. And somewhere thousands of miles away, a father was about to learn that the institution he walked away from had never fully walked away from his child. Media storm. How the leak reached the outside world. The palace had hoped to contain the breach. They had hoped the discovery would remain trapped within the quiet, frost-rimmed corridors of Buckingham Palace, handled discreetly, absorbed internally, forgotten before dawn the next day. But within institutions this old, silence is a fragile thing. It cracks easily. And on that December morning, it shattered faster than anyone expected. It began with a single message, an internal alert sent from the sovereign's household office to a senior aide at Kensington Palace. A message that should have remained encrypted and unseen. But the aide, rushing between meetings, forwarded the alert to a secondary inbox managed by a junior staff member. A simple misstep, a moment of human error. By the time the message landed in the secondary inbox, the attached snippet, a redacted header referencing Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor educational notes, was no longer behind the palace's secure firewall. For 20 minutes it sat vulnerable. And in those 20 minutes, it was seen not by the press, not by an outsider, but by an internal contractor with ties to a media researcher. And that was all it took. Shortly after 2 that afternoon, a journalist at a mid-tier British outlet, one known for sniffing out palace tension with almost uncanny accuracy, received a tip. Not a document, not a file, just a whisper of a headline. Internal palace briefing contains sensitive references to Archie's schooling. No details, no context, just enough to spark appetite. By 4 o'clock, the newsroom phones were buzzing. Editors argued over wording. Legal teams warned of caution, but the opportunity was irresistible. Royal stories in December always carried weight, but anything involving Harry, Meghan, or their children sent metrics surging within minutes. At 5:30, the first online headline appeared, cautiously phrased, wrapped in speculative language. A senior palace document reportedly mentions Archie's education. Buckingham Palace declines comment. It was vague, technical, easy to dismiss, and for precisely that reason, it spread like wildfire. Within 10 minutes, 2 major British tabloid sites picked it up, each sharpening the tone. The story morphed from whisper to a simmering scandal. Commentators began asking pointed questions. Why would the palace have such information? Had privacy rules been broken? Was Archie's data still being stored in royal systems? By 6:15, American networks noticed. It was Columbia Broadcasting System that first interrupted an evening segment with a breaking news scroll. Channel's news network followed by inviting a royal analyst to comment live on air. And within an hour, the story leapt across social media, propelled by viewers who had watched Harry grow from childhood into troubled adulthood, who remembered the anguish of 1997, who still carried sympathies shaped by Diana's long, bruising battle with the palace. Older American audiences, those over 50, reacted with particular force. To them, the idea of royal record-keeping touching a child who now lived outside the institution felt like history repeating itself. The past reaching into the present, the very thing Harry had tried to escape. By 8 o'clock in New York, the narrative had shifted entirely. It was no longer about a misfiled document. It was about a perceived violation of trust. Channel's news network senior correspondent said the line that would reverberate through the night, "This isn't an error. It's a symbol, one that speaks to why Prince Harry left." In London, palace staff felt the world closing in. Phones lit up. Screens refreshed endlessly. Press officers drafted, redrafted, and abandoned statements that no longer seemed strong enough. Inside the palace communications room, William's team moved swiftly. They understood how narratives crystallized. Once the American conversation set a frame, Britain would follow. And once Britain followed, the monarchy would face a crisis far larger than an administrative misstep. By 9:30, commentators in the United Kingdom were openly debating whether the palace had knowingly retained information about Harry's children. Some spoke in measured tones, others spoke with outrage, but the tone was unmistakable. The monarchy looked careless, outdated, and dangerously out of touch. Across the Atlantic, Meghan's name began trending in the United States, then Harry's, then Archie's. Even late-night hosts joined in, one remarking with quiet disbelief, "How does a palace lose track of a file about a child who doesn't even live there?" By 10 o'clock London time, the story had reached the one place the palace feared most, California. A single headline flashed across Harry and Meghan's phones only 20 minutes apart. "Palace leak may involve Archie's school records." The world had broken the news before the monarchy had time to breathe. In Buckingham Palace, the winter night thickened. Lights burned past midnight in offices where aides moved with tense, deliberate silence. The king had been briefed. William had been informed. And had been alerted. The legal office was already drafting emergency language. But across the ocean, in a quiet Montecito home, a father was staring at a glowing screen with a look the world had not seen in years. A look that meant he was no longer staying where he was.